most central to the stress response, and the one that studies show to
Good
be
evening,
most
Earth.
dysregulated
This is Adam Sturch
after
broadcasting
chronic
from the
stress.
Mushroom Mansion Taos, New Mexico,
Autoimmune connective tissue
working on
diseases,
oil painting
from
nurture.
SLE and
Alright,
rheumatoid arthritis,
tonight I'm going to
scleroderma,
lay in
and
a
ankylosing
brighter, lighter
spondylitis
white across the
reflect
flesh
an
tones,
exhaustion and disruption
light
of the
bluish
organism's
green
normal
actually,
stress control
and then
mechanisms.
hit the middle ground
Exhaustion
mountains
is
with
the
a
word
light,
that leapt
slightly
to mind
lighter
as a former
emerald
patient of
green
mine with
to start
ankylosing
giving the
spondylitis
highlight side of
described
those
his life
mountains a
prior
little
to
bit
the
of texture
onset
and
this
detail.
disease, and even after. Robert is a prominent British Columbia labor leader. I interviewed him in his office. A large and affable man in his late 40s, Robert speaks with a resonant voice and a hearty humor. When he needs to turn his head to answer the phone or to look at you from a slightly different angle, he swivels his whole trunk. There is virtually no movement in his spine. "Everything's frozen from my neck to my butt," he says. When he was 25, Robert began experiencing pain in his heels, followed by 12 years of unremitting pain in the joints of his shoulders and collarbone. He went to doctors a few times, but soon gave up. "They keep telling you it is this or that, or it is not this or that. They don't give you anything for relief. What else are you going to do about it?" He finally saw a rheumatologist, following 5 years of pain in his hip and legs. "I would favor my left leg to the point that I was lying in bed one night and my partner noticed that one leg was smaller than the other. The muscles had shrunk because I didn't use it. Of course, she went into hysterics and made me go to the doctor." In the 12 years between the onset of his symptoms and his diagnosis, Robert never missed work. In many respects, his story was typical. Every trade union official I've ever treated in my practice has been beyond overwork. The demands on their time have been enormous, to say nothing of the inherent stress in the job itself, with the constant conflict and the politics, the long, unpredictable hours, meetings, never-ending duties. "Our pension plans in the labor movement are very, very good," says Robert. "The reason we have very good pension plans is that nobody lives to 65 to collect their pensions, or very few. That's why the pension plan for those of us in the labor movement is so strong. Nobody ever retires." When his rheumatic disease began, Robert was traveling about 100,000 miles a year by air all over North America. In 1976, which he calls his worst year, he was on the road for a consecutive period of 4.5 months. "Never saw home all that time. I was working on a strike in the southern U.S. because I was in an international union that didn't have anybody with the skills needed. I was in Arkansas and Oklahoma and Georgia, working 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week." He would sleep during whatever time was left over. What was going on in your personal life? "Wife, 2 kids. Labor movement work always kills marriages. I don't know any of my friends still married to their original wives. There are guys that I started with in 1973. Some are dead, but some have had 2 or 3, and one guy has had 5 marriages. This work just chews them up and spits them out. You're never there and never contribute. I feel bad about it now. At the time I was too stupid to feel bad about it. I didn't recognize what I had. I've got a close relationship with my kids now. They're grown up. I don't remember my son very much when he was a teenager and when he was a little child. Well, I've got photographs. I didn't even know I had a daughter until she was 20. I don't think I questioned it because everybody else was doing the same thing. It was just part of the culture. Dead marriages and booze were just common. I was the first one in my peer group to stop drinking. Robert says he has an addictive personality. Not just to work. Booze, drugs, women, gambling, the whole 9 yards. I haven't had a drink since September 2nd, 1980 at 7:40 p.m. That was the last time I had a beer. I got tired of waking up on the floor with my tongue stuck to the carpet and feeling like a bag of shit. I've also quit smoking 132 times. Problem is, I've started 133 times. That's the one addiction I haven't been able to break. What drew Robert to union organizing, and what still keeps him committed to it, is the opportunity to improve people's lives and to work for a more fair, more equitable society. That's why you never say no. There's always so much more to be done. The list of injustices never gets any shorter. I feel very fortunate to be able to contribute to making this a better world. Robert has now developed the capacity to say no to excessive demands. Interestingly, and perhaps not coincidentally, He also finds that his ankylosing spondylitis, with the complete fusion of his ribs and his vertebrae, has conferred an unexpected benefit in emotional expression. I have an advantage over others in terms of expressing anger. I have a command of the language. I never shout at anybody. I don't have to shout, because I can put words right through you just by controlling my breathing. One of the good things about AS is that it freezes your ribs, so your ribs are locked in front and back. Robert explains that when people become upset and lose control of their angry responses, they breathe in a very shallow fashion, using the muscles between the ribs to inflate the chest cavity and thus to draw air into the lungs. Because of his AS, he is unable to do that. In order to have a stronger voice and more control over the way you speak, you have to breathe with your diaphragm. You don't breathe there. You breathe shallowly and your ribs move in and out. My gut goes up and down because I have to breathe with my diaphragm. There's much more muscle control in the diaphragm than there is over top of the ribs. It also affords better emotional control and ensures improved oxygen supply to the thinking parts of the brain. Before, I had to work at it. As my ribs froze up, I didn't have any choice. And that's most interesting. Teachers of yogic breathing are always telling us to breathe using the diaphragm. That's the healthy thing to do. Your AS forced you to do that. It gives me the power of clarity. You can tell if most people are angry because they shout at you. That's the way, verbally, they can express that they're angry. With my breathing the way it is, I have to speak in shorter sentences, and I can clip words and project my voice rather than yell. Controlling your breathing allows you to control your temper and your anger. And by controlling, I mean using it to get where you want to go. As Robert spoke, I was struck by the uncanny ability of nature to teach through adult disease lessons that, in a better world, should be learned in childhood and in health. One study pointed to the intriguing possibility that even the painful inflammation of rheumatoid arthritis could serve a protective function. Joint tenderness was significantly related to a decrease in stressful events 1 week later. The results have important clinical implications, the researchers concluded. The dynamic interplay between social conflict events and joint pain describe a homeostatic system in which negative social interaction is regulated through worsening of the disease. In other words, the flare-up of disease forced patients into avoiding stressful interactions. The body says no. The presence of the antibody in these subjects suggests that emotional repression had already initiated immune reactivity against the cell, although not to the point of clinical disease. One might expect that should additional stressful events occur in the lives of these women, they could further incite the immune mutiny, activate inflammation, and trigger frank disease. Emotional disturbances in conjunction with rheumatoid factor may lead to rheumatoid disease, the researchers concluded. It is also possible to develop rheumatoid arthritis without the anti-self antibody RF. As we would expect, in those cases, the degree of stress may even have to be greater, precisely as found in another study. A 1987 review of the literature concluded that the weight of evidence from a variety of studies strongly suggests a role for psychologic stress in inducing, exacerbating, and effecting the ultimate outcome in rheumatoid arthritis. Just how specific the effect of stress can be in provoking autoimmune disease is illustrated by the experience of Rachel, a young Jewish woman. Her first episode of rheumatoid arthritis occurred in response to an event that was a reenactment of childhood emotional trauma. Rachel had grown up in conflict with her older brother, whom she always perceived to be the favored sibling. The parents separated, and she felt especially rejected by her father. "I was always the second-class citizen," she says. "It was my brother that he wanted. I still remember walking halfway down the block by myself behind them, my father with his arm around my brother. I remember always having to go into the back seat. I was told by my mother quite a few years ago that I went to Chicago to visit my dad with my brother only because, she said, you take both kids or you don't take either. I was never wanted there." As a child, Rachel says she was another good little girl who never caused any problems, a coping style she continued into adulthood. 2 years ago on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year celebration, she was at her mother's home preparing dinner for the family. She was in a hurry, since she was to leave in time to avoid meeting her brother, who had decided to join the family at the last moment. He didn't want to come with me there, so we made an agreement that I would go early to my mother's house and help her cook. At 4 p.m. I would leave so he and my sister-in-law and niece could spend the rest of Rosh Hashanah with my mother. Am I getting this right? I interjected. What you're saying is that you would go there and cook and do all the work, and then you'd leave so others can have a nice ceremony together? Why did you accept that arrangement? Because it was Rosh Hashanah and I feel families should be together. What happened? When I was at my mother's house, my body went into pain that you wouldn't believe. I was taken to the hospital. The arthritis was in one of my legs, and I couldn't use it at all. I don't usually scream in pain. The whole emergency room heard me, I'm sure. The very next day, I was back at the hospital because it was throughout my whole body. I could not move. Even being wheeled in a wheelchair, I was screaming my head off. Not only are the onset and flare-ups of rheumatic diseases related to stress, but so is their severity. In a study initiated in 1967, 50 young adults newly diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis were followed over a period of 5 years. Psychosocial stress factors preceding the onset of the disease were assessed at the beginning. All of the patients were examined twice yearly and had annual x-rays of the wrists and hands, the commonest locations of disease activity. At study's end, the subjects were classified according to the degree of tissue damage. In Category 1, no swelling on physical examination or x-ray evidence of bone destruction called erosions. In Category 2, soft tissue swelling but no bone erosions. In Category 3, bone erosions in the wrists and hands. The results were published in the American Journal of Medicine. The researchers observed that the patients who would eventually place in Category 3 were, on entering the study, judged by the interviewers to have a significantly higher frequency of psychosocial stress factors associated with the onset of disease than those who finished in the other categories. Most of the interviews I conducted in preparing this book took place in people's homes. Gila, a 51-year-old woman with rheumatoid arthritis, insisted on meeting at the neighborhood McDonald's outlet. She could serve as the prototype of the self-sacrificing, conforming, self-conscious, shy, inhibited, perfectionistic rheumatoid patient described in the psychological literature. Gila was diagnosed in 1976 during an episode of polymytosis, or generalized muscle inflammation. By the time she sought medical attention, she had lost much of her muscle bulk in her shoulders and hips. Her muscles of respiration were so weakened that she was breathing in a shallow way. She couldn't lift her arms or legs or swallow anything dry. When the specialist saw her, she was hospitalized immediately for a course of intravenous corticosteroid medication. He said I was a walking corpse. I should not even have been walking around. On my lung function tests, when I was blowing into the machine, the needle would not move. Not even the slightest movement. But I compensated. I didn't realize. When I was walking, I didn't notice that I was swinging instead of lifting my leg. Why do you suppose you didn't notice? I was busy, I guess. I was tired. Because I had 2 kids, small kids, and I was running around. I'm curious why you wanted to meet me at McDonald's. At home, I'm always self-conscious about how my house looks. It has to be clean and tidy. If somebody comes to my house and notices that there is dust here or there, then you're not talking about tidiness. You're talking about perfection. You can't get away from dust, can you? Dust is part of life. And if you can't accept that, everything has to be perfect. Are you that way with everything? Yeah. Before I had the rheumatoid arthritis, actually, I was even more. My aunts called me a superwoman. My husband used to go out of town. He had to work in a sawmill for his apprenticeship. I was by myself here with 2 kids. I worked, and I worked overtime because we just bought a house. Sometimes I worked 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. What did you do? I used to work for the post office. I enjoyed the work, though. You liked working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week? Going to work is almost like going on holiday. I enjoyed the people there. I was friends with the supervisor. Nobody gave me a hard time. Although everybody seems to be bored about post office work around me, I just can't understand why they are bored and complaining. I'm having a good time. So I think that was one of the reasons, too, that I had rheumatoid at first. I think I was abusing myself. I didn't have enough rest, not enough sleep. In addition to her job and her housework, Gila also felt she needed to maintain an immaculate garden and backyard. Her home was located between the houses of two retired couples who kept their yards to perfection, and she was concerned that if she neglected her garden, their house values would go down. Yes, impeccable. They would mow every week, so I have to do my lawn every week to keep up. She also was keen for her children to be exposed to opportunities she herself had missed. On weekends, she drove them to piano lessons, singing lessons, ballet lessons, folk dancing, sports events. Gila did all this without any assistance from her husband, and all the while worked at the post office on the afternoon shift from 4:30 p.m. until 1 a.m. She slept about 4 hours a night for years. When I had my rheumatoid arthritis, my physiotherapist told me, when you have the pain, you have to stop. You have to rest because that means your body is telling you that you need to stop. And so I do that. But the thing is, my housework is not done the way it used to be. Before, I would vacuum every other day, or even twice a day. Now, my husband is the one doing the vacuuming because I can't do it anymore. And I'm not happy with the way he vacuums. So sometimes I do it after him, although I don't let him know that. I'm just doing the finishing. My house is not clean or neat or tidy the way it used to be. Gila was brought up in the Philippines, amid circumstances the listener by now will have guessed. She was the eldest of 8 children and the caregiver to all. Her parents criticized her mercilessly. When anything went wrong, she was spanked. I had asthma, and every time I got a spanking, the asthma came. And every time I got the asthma, my mom would say, "Oh, that's God's punishment because you were bad, because you didn't do your job, because you answered back." So then I tried to do everything. I was not purposefully being bad. I was doing my best, and I was still being punished when I forgot. And sometimes I just couldn't do it the way she wanted it. She is also a perfectionist. Gila's husband beat her in the early years of their marriage. Later, the abuse lapsed into emotional indifference, but he continues to be morbidly jealous and controlling. Although some physiotherapists brought up stress issues in their work with Gila, none of the physicians who have treated her for rheumatoid arthritis ever inquired about her personal or emotional life. The wisdom of Sir William Osler has been lost in that vast Bermuda Triangle of modern medical practice. After she developed her illness, Gila realized she needed to do some psychological work. She understood that her disease, unwelcome as it was perhaps trying to teach her something. The medical system was unable to help. At her own request, Gila was referred to a psychiatrist. He told me that I should not be so upset, that I should treat my husband like he was my oldest son. I didn't go back. I didn't want a third son, I wanted a husband. In women with rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system has shown increased disturbances during periods of stress, but those who enjoyed better marriage relationships were spared exacerbations of disease activity like inflammation and pain. Another study found that increases in relationship stresses were associated with increases in joint inflammation. Results like these are not surprising. Recall that stress is a response to a perception of threat. Laboratory studies have demonstrated that many organs and tissues of the body become more vulnerable to inflammation and harm during or after periods perceived as threatening. Stimuli interpreted as potentially dangerous can instantaneously induce dilation of blood vessels, swelling, bleeding, increased susceptibility to tissue damage, and a lowered pain threshold. Such changes can be initiated rapidly in subjects simply by interview techniques that augment the perception of threat. There are several potential pathways by which overwhelming psychological pressures could become manifested as inflammation in joints, connective tissues, and body organs. One of the teachings of the influential 2nd century Roman physician Galen was that any part of the body
All right,
can
well, that
affect
gets
any
the
other part
highlights
through neural connections.
starting
The rapid
to
body changes in response to stress
shine
are, no
a
doubt,
little bit.
effected through
Gets some of
instantaneous
the
activity
green
of the
a
nervous
little more
system.
pronounced in the middle ground
Discharges
hills.
originating in the
And what I
brain
think I want to do
can
now
stimulate
is go
far-away
ahead and
nerve
mix up
endings to release
a
powerful
yellow gray
pro-inflammatory
or
molecules capable of inducing joint
ochre
damage through
gray,
hyperactivity of the
and
immune
finish
cells.
out the
Some
spiraling pattern
nerve-derived chemicals are
on
also
either
potent
side. So I'm going to take a
irritating
breather
agents
and
for
then do that.
reducing pain.
So be
In
back shortly
autoimmune
with a
diseases,
second take.
elevated the virus or to develop clinical disease had the
All
following in
right. Oh,
common.
forgot to stop my
They
watch.
had high
That's
ambitions
okay.
for themselves.
Okay.
They were
So
struggling
we've got a little
academically.
bit of
They had
red ochre,
fathers who
yellow
were
ochre,
high
and
achievers.
Payne's gray mixed up
We can see here the relationship between
into
the
some
stress
linseed oil.
and the perceived need to live up to parental expectation. That is, between the internal
With
biological
a pretty
milieu and the
loose,
child's
inky
continuing
consistency.
need to gain acceptance.
And now we're just going to zoom in on
In
this
another
spot
study,
here and do the left
married
side
women were
first and then
matched with
swing
an
over to
equal
the
number
right
of
side.
women who were divorced
All
or
right, here we
separated.
go.
In the married group, marital quality and satisfaction were assessed by means of self-reports. Immune system activity was studied in blood samples drawn from each participant. Poorer marital quality was strongly and positively related to poorer immune response. In the divorced or separated group, the two psychological factors most closely associated with diminished immune functioning were the time elapsed since the breakup, the more recent the marriage failure, the greater the immune suppression, and the woman's degree of attachment to the former spouse. The greater the emotional attachment, the worse the immune function. Women who were more self-regulated, less emotionally dependent on a relationship that failed to work for them, had stronger immune systems. Greater differentiation means better health. The less powerful partner in any relationship will absorb a disproportionate amount of the shared anxiety, which is the reason that so many more women than men are treated for, say, anxiety or depression. The issue here is not strength, but power. That is, who is serving whose needs. It is not that these women are more psychologically unbalanced than their husbands, even though the latter may seem to function at higher levels. What is unbalanced is the relationship, so that the women are absorbing their husband's stresses and anxieties while also having to contain their own. We recall that Nancy, wife of a man with ulcerative colitis, was exasperated at the stress triggered for her by her husband's obsessive and rigid controlling attitudes. See Chapter 10. Tim's disease had been in reasonable control over the years. Nancy has effectively absorbed much of his anxiety, but at her own expense. Nancy is now being treated for depression and anxiety, and says she is nearing the end of her rope. It has felt like I have another child, she says, because he is very high maintenance. I now understand that I have 4 children I've been responsible for. I'm the parent for both of us. I've repressed my emotional needs for a very long time without realizing it. It's frightening to think now that I wasn't even aware of that until I had a mini breakdown. If Nancy lets go of her one-sided nurturing role in the relationship, Tim may experience a flare-up of his colitis, unless he learns to take more emotional responsibility for himself. The partner who must suppress more of his or her own needs for the sake of the relationship is more likely to develop physical illness as well. Hence, the greater incidence, for example, of autoimmune disease and of non-smoking related cancers among women. The existence of a mind-body link and a person-person link means that it is possible for anxiety in one person to be manifested as a physical symptom in another person, Dr. Kerr writes. As is the case with the emotional dysfunctions, the one prone to develop symptoms is the spouse who adapts most to maintain harmony in the relationship system. Nature's ultimate goal is to foster the growth of the individual from absolute dependence to independence, or, more exactly, to the interdependence of mature adults living in community. Development is a process of moving from complete external regulation to self-regulation, as far as our genetic programming allows. Well self-regulated people are the most capable of interacting fruitfully with others in the community and of nurturing children who will also grow into self-regulated adults. Anything that interferes with that natural agenda threatens the organism's chances for long-term survival. Almost from the beginning of life, we see a tension between the complementary needs for security and for autonomy. Development requires a gradual and age-appropriate shift from security needs toward the drive for autonomy, from attachment to individuation. Neither is ever completely lost, and neither is meant to predominate at the expense of the other. With an increased capacity for self-regulation in adulthood comes also a heightened need for autonomy, for the freedom to make genuine choices. Whatever undermines autonomy will be experienced as a source of stress. Stress is magnified whenever the power to respond effectively to the social or physical environment is lacking, or when the tested animal or human being feels helpless, without meaningful choices. In other words, when autonomy is undermined. Autonomy, however, needs to be exercised in a way that does not disrupt the social relationships on which survival also depends, whether with emotional intimates or with important others, employers, fellow workers, social authority figures. The less the emotional capacity for self-regulation develops during infancy and childhood, the more the adult depends on relationships to maintain homeostasis. The greater the dependence, the greater the threat when those relationships are lost or become insecure. Thus, the vulnerability to subjective and physiological stress will be proportionate to the degree of emotional dependence. To minimize the stress from threatened relationships, a person may give up some part of his autonomy. However, this is not a formula for health, since the loss of autonomy is itself a cause of stress. The surrender of autonomy raises the stress level, even if on the surface it appears to be necessary for the sake of security in a relationship, and even if we subjectively feel relief when we gain security in this manner. If I chronically repress my emotional needs in order to make myself acceptable to other people, I increase my risks of having to pay the price in the form of illness. The other way of protecting oneself from the stress of threatened relationships is emotional shutdown. To feel safe, the vulnerable person withdraws from others and closes against intimacy. This coping style may avoid anxiety and block the subjective experience of stress, but not the physiology of it. Emotional intimacy is a psychological and biological necessity. Those who build walls against intimacy are not self-regulated, just emotionally frozen. Their stress from having unmet needs will be high. Social support helps to ameliorate physiological stress. The close links between health and the social environment have been amply demonstrated. In the Alameda County study, those more socially isolated were more susceptible to illness of many types. In 3 separate studies of aging people, 5-year mortality risks were associated directly with social integration. The more socially connected a person was, the lower their risk of death. Social ties and support, a group of researchers concluded, remain powerful predictors of morbidity and mortality in their own right, independent of any associations with other risk factors. For the adult, therefore, biological stress regulation depends on a delicate balance between social and relationship security on the one hand and genuine autonomy on the other. Whatever upsets that balance, whether or not the individual is consciously aware of it, is a source of stress. A recent Australian study pointed to the importance of positive social relationships in modulating stress. 514 women who required breast biopsies were interviewed. Slightly fewer than half of the subjects were subsequently diagnosed with cancer, the others with benign tumors. The results revealed a significant interaction between highly threatening life stressors and social support. Women experiencing a stressor objectively rated as highly threatening and who were without intimate emotional social support had a 9-fold increase in risk of developing breast carcinoma. The investigators found themselves taken by surprise. They write, "Our finding of an interaction between severely threatening life events and the absence of social support was somewhat unexpected given the absence of independent effect. Yet this finding is no more startling than learning that non-swimmers without life jackets are not at risk of drowning, at least not until they are thrown into deep water. The listener will remember from Chapter 1 that medical students under the stress of exams were shown to have diminished immune system activity, but that the most isolated among them were the most vulnerable. The physiological functioning of human beings is inseparable, even in theory, let alone in practice, from the emotional and social connections that help to sustain us. A 17-year follow-up study of residents in Alameda County, California, looked at the possible links between people's social connectedness or sense of isolation and the onset of cancer. In this prospective study, none of the adults enrolled at the start had cancer. The risk factor of major interest for women appeared to be social isolation, not only being isolated, but also of feeling isolated. Given the effect of emotions on hormonal regulation, it is not unlikely that isolation may have a direct promotional effect on the development of this set of cancers. The researchers grouped cancers of the female breast, ovary, and uterus as hormone-related. We do not all mirror one another in how we are physiologically affected by social and interpersonal stressors or other external pressures. What, apart from inborn temperament, accounts for these individual differences? A key factor is emotional development. Should the child in the first example require a further operation at the age of 25, she will no longer need her mother and father to hold her hand while the anesthetic is administered. She will have enough self-regulation that neither her neurotransmitter activity nor her stress hormones would go out of balance without her parents' immediate proximity. We cannot take it for granted, however, that with chronological adulthood, we automatically attain emotional independence. At any age, our responses to potential stressors are deeply influenced by the degree to which our emotional functioning continues to be dominated by our attachment needs, fears, and anxieties. According to the family systems theory articulated by the late American psychiatrist Dr. Murray Bowen, illness is not a simple biological event in a separate human being. A family systems view recognizes the moment-to-moment interrelatedness of the physiological functioning of individuals. Self-evident in the relationship of mother and fetus, this physiological interrelatedness does not end with birth or even with physical maturation. As we have seen, relationships remain important biological regulators throughout a whole life. A fundamental concept in family systems theory is differentiation, defined as the ability to be in emotional contact with others, yet still autonomous in one's emotional functioning. The poorly differentiated person lacks an emotional boundary between himself and others, and lacks a boundary that prevents his thinking process from being overwhelmed by his emotional feeling process. He automatically absorbs anxiety from others and generates considerable anxiety within himself. The well-differentiated person can respond from an open acceptance of her own emotions, which are not tailored either to match someone else's expectations or to resist them. She neither suppresses her emotions nor acts them out impulsively. Dr. Michael Kerr, a former colleague of Murray Bowen's, is currently director of the Georgetown University Family Center, Washington, D.C. Dr. Kerr distinguishes between two types of differentiation: functional differentiation and basic differentiation. The two types may superficially appear to be identical, but from the perspective of health and stress, they are worlds apart. Functional differentiation refers to a person's ability to function based on his relationships with others. For instance, it may be that I can do my work well only when other people, my employees, my spouse, my children, can absorb my unresolved anxieties by putting up with my bad temper, unreliable habits, lack of emotional engagement, or even abusive behavior. Were they to reject roles I assign them, I might fall apart. That would be an example of functional differentiation. On the other hand, if my ability to function is independent of other people's having to do my emotional work for me, that is, if I can remain engaged with others while staying emotionally open to them and to myself, then I would be said to have basic differentiation. The less basic differentiation a person has attained, the more prone he is to experience emotional stress and physical illness. In a study of stress, adaptation, and immunity, 1,400 military cadets at West Point were followed for 4 years. They were tested psychologically and had regular blood tests to study their susceptibility to the Epstein-Barr virus, the causative agent for infectious mononucleosis. Those most susceptible to contract the virus or to develop clinical disease had the following in common. They had high ambitions for themselves. They were struggling academically. They had fathers who were high achievers. We can see here the relationship between the stress and the perceived need to live up to parental expectation. That is, between the internal biological milieu and the child's continuing need to gain acceptance. In another study, married women were matched with an equal number of women who were divorced or separated. In the married group, marital quality and satisfaction were assessed by means of self-reports. Immune system activity was studied in blood samples drawn from each participant. Poorer marital quality was strongly and positively related to poorer immune response. In the divorced or separated group, the two psychological factors most closely associated with diminished immune functioning were the time elapsed since the breakup, the more recent the marriage failure, the greater the immune suppression, and the woman's degree of attachment to the former spouse. The greater the emotional attachment, the worse the immune function. Women who were more self-regulated, less emotionally dependent on a relationship that failed to work for them, had stronger immune systems. Greater differentiation means better health. The less powerful partner in any relationship will absorb a disproportionate amount of the shared anxiety, which is the reason that so many more women than men are treated for, say,
I'm going to take a break here and pick it up
The issue here is not strength,
with this side.
but power. Neurochemicals have been
Alright,
measured after
on
only a
to the
few
right
days of
side here.
separation from their mothers.
Paying attention to this
In the
Gabor talk
parent-child
while I'm working
interaction, it is
and
established
about to have a
child's
panic
sense
attack
the
of the
world.
full
Whether
version.
this is
See,
a world
when I did the
of love
YouTube
and
versions,
acceptance,
this is
a world of
when the body
neglect and
says no.
indifference in which one must root and scratch to have one's
I
needs satisfied,
cut the entire
or
version
worse,
together as a
a world of
13-hour
hostility,
set
where one must forever
and then cut it in
maintain
half
anxious hypervigilance.
and did a part A and part B.
Future relationships will have
But the way my
adequate
editor is
templates,
set up,
nerve
I had to do
circuits
this
laid
in
down
a
in
kind of an
our
odd
relationships
order.
with our
So I
earliest
think I may have
caregivers.
repeated
We will
each
understand
chapter in the
ourselves
full
as we have
version,
felt
and I'm
understood.
hoping that's not the
Love
case in the
ourselves
versions
as
that
we
I
perceive
posted.
being loved on the
So
deepest unconscious
I'm
levels.
just kind of running
Care
it
for
through and
ourselves
checking it
with as much compassion
and
as
kind of
before
freaking out,
we
thinking I
perceived
fucked it up
as young
completely.
children.
So I hope not.
Disruption of
Anyway,
attachment relationships
if I
in
did, I'll
infancy
fix
and
it and post a new
may
version.
have
But
long-term
for the
consequences
moment,
the brain's
I
stress
put on
response
the
apparatus and for the
versions
immune
I
system.
posted, part A and
A
part
large
B,
number of
or
animal
part 1 and part
experiments
2.
have established a
And
powerful connection
this is the
between
second
early
half,
attachment
so I'm
disturbances
hoping it doesn't
and
repeat.
unbalanced stress
So if I
response
seem
capacities in the
distressed,
adult.
that's the
The
reason.
crux of this research
That
is
and
that
understanding
disrupted
exactly
attachment
how
in
and why I'm
infancy
going to
leads
die
to
because I have a
exaggerated
complete
physiological stress
incapacity to
responses
express a human
in the
emotion
adult.
or form a human relationship.
Conversely,
But that's something to work
nurturing
on
attachment
aside from
interactions in
this.
infancy
So here we
provide
go
for
for now.
better modulated biological stress reactions in the adult. For the satisfaction of attachment needs in human beings, more than physical proximity and touching is required. Equally essential is a nourishing emotional connection, in particular, the quality of attunement. Attunement, a process in which the parent is tuned in to the child's emotional needs, is a subtle process. It is deeply instinctive, but easily subverted when the parent is stressed or distracted emotionally, financially, or for any other reason. Attunement may also be absent if the parent never received it in his or her childhood. Strong attachment and love exist in many parent-child relationships, but without attunement. Children in non-attuned relationships may feel love, but on a deeper level do not experience themselves as appreciated for who they really are. They learn to present only their acceptable side to the parent, repressing emotional responses the parent rejects, and learning to reject themselves for even having such responses. Infants whose caregivers were too stressed, for whatever reason, to give them the necessary attunement contact will grow up with a chronic tendency to feel alone with their emotions, to have a sense, rightly or wrongly, that no one can share how they feel, that no one can understand. We are speaking here not of a lack of parental love, nor of physical separation between parent and child, but of a void in the child's perception of being seen, understood, empathized with, and got on the emotional level. The phenomenon of physical closeness but emotional separation has been called proximate separation. Proximate separation happens when attuned contact between parent and child is lacking or is interrupted due to stresses on the parent that draw her away from the interaction. An example of such an attunement break occurs when the parent looks away first from the child during one of their intensely pleasurable eye-to-eye gaze interactions. Another attunement break occurs if the parent insists on stimulating a resting child because he, the parent, desires the mutual engagement, even if the child at that moment needs some respite from the intensity of their interaction. Primate experiments show that infants can undergo severe separation reactions, even though their mothers are visually, but not psychologically, available, writes the UCLA psychologist, theorist, and researcher Alan Shore. I suggest that proximate separations are a common and potent phenomenon in early personality development. In proximate separations, the parents are physically present but emotionally absent. Such parent-child interactions are increasingly the norm in our hyper-stressed society. The levels of physiological stress experienced by the child during proximate separation approaches the levels experienced during physical separation. Proximate separation affects the young child on the unconscious physiological levels rather than on the conscious thought-feeling levels. It will not be recalled later as the adult looks back on his childhood experience, but it is entrenched as the biology of loss. Experiences of proximate separation become part of the person's psychological programming. People trained in this way in childhood are likely to choose adult relationships that reenact repeated proximate separation dynamics. They may, for example, choose partners who do not understand, accept, or appreciate them for who they are. Thus, the physiological stresses induced by proximal separation will also continue to be repeated in adult life, and, again, often without conscious awareness. Chapter 16. The Dance of Generations. Given the information presented in previous chapters, it may seem as though parents are to blame for the later development of illness in their offspring. Such a conclusion is quite contrary to my intentions and entirely out of keeping with the scientific evidence. Parenting styles do not reflect greater or lesser degrees of love in the heart of the father and mother. Other, more mundane factors are at play. Parental love is infinite, and for a very practical reason. The selfless nurturing of the young is embedded in the attachment apparatus of the mammalian brain. If a parent's loving feelings are constricted, it is only because that parent has himself or herself suffered deep hurt. In my work with drug addicts in Vancouver's downtown east side, I treat many substance-dependent men and women. Hardened as they are, with their criminal records, their continued drug seeking, their HIV infections, and their harassed and socially marginal lives, the deepest pain they all have is about the children whom they have abandoned or who have been taken from them. Without exception, they themselves were abused or abandoned in childhood. Where parenting fails to communicate unconditional acceptance to the child, it is because of the fact that the child receives the parent's love not as the parent wishes, but as it is refracted through the parent's personality. If the parent is stressed, harbors unresolved anxiety, or is agitated by unmet emotional needs, the child is likely to find herself in situations of proximate abandonment, regardless of the parent's intentions. For better or worse, many of our parenting attitudes and responses have to do with our own experiences as children. That modes of parenting reflect the parent's early childhood conditioning is evident both from animal observations and from sophisticated psychological studies of humans. Rhesus monkeys are a species of primates favored by psychological investigators because of their relatively small size and ease of care. In a troop of these monkeys, about 20% are high reactors who are more likely than others to exhibit depressive behaviors on separation from mother, along with greater and longer activation of the HPA axis, exaggerated sympathetic nervous system arousal, and deeper suppression of immune activity. In human terms, we might call the high reactors temperamentally hypersensitive. Not unlike their human counterparts, they tend to end up at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Their offspring resemble them in behavior, reactivity, and social status. Research has revealed that the constitutional high reactor destiny can be interrupted by changing the environment. The positive changes are passed on to future generations. When reared with especially nurturing mothers, such animals show no signs of the usual behavioral disorder. Instead, they showed signs of precocious behavioral development and rose to the top of the hierarchy as adults. Females adopted the maternal style typical of their especially nurturing mothers. These observations are not about learned behaviors, strictly speaking. For the most part, parent-child similarities in nurturing approach do not reflect cognitive learning, either in animals or in human beings. The intergenerational transmission of parenting style is largely a matter of physiological development, of how the limbic circuits of the brain become programmed in childhood and how the connections within the PNI supersystem are established. As discussed in the previous chapter, the emotional brain of the child develops under the influence of the emotional brain of the parent. The child does not learn the parenting styles of his mother and father by imitation, or only in part. The biggest influence on the future parenting style of the child is the development of his emotional and attachment circuits in the context of his relationship with his parents. The same is true of the development of the child's stress response apparatus. One dramatic animal experiment will suffice to illustrate this principle. Tranquilizers like Valium and Ativan belong to a class of drugs called benzodiazepines. Like all pharmacological agents that affect mental functions, they work because certain brain areas have receptors for similar natural tranquilizing substances manufactured in the brain itself. The amygdala, an almond-shaped structure in the temporal lobe of the brain, is one of the main regulators of the fear and anxiety response. It is supplied with natural benzodiazepine receptors that, when activated, cool down our fearful reactions. Compared with adult rats who received less nurturing, in adult rats who had been licked and groomed more by their mothers, the amygdala was found to contain many more benzodiazepine receptors. Maternal care in infancy influenced the physiology of anxiety regulation in the brain of the adult. These differences were not explained by genetic factors. Although the psychological development of humans is much more complex than that of animals, intergenerational transmission of parenting behavior and of stress is also the general rule. It is similar to the development of the child's stress response. As a group of Canadian researchers have written, maternal care during infancy serves to program behavioral responses to stress in the offspring by altering the development of the neural systems that mediate fearfulness. In short, anxious mothers are likely to rear anxious offspring down through the generations. Researchers developed scores assessing the quality of parent-child bonding. Scores of parental bonding were measured across 3 generations, between adult mothers and their mothers, and between these same adult mothers and their own daughters. The measures of bonding between mothers and daughters were consistent across the generations. In the adult children of Holocaust survivors with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, disturbances of the HPA axis and cortisol production were found. The more severe was the parent's PTSD, the greater was the impairment in their children's cortisol mechanisms. Mary Ainsworth, an early associate of John Bowlby's and later professor of developmental psychology at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, devised a method of assessing the pattern and quality of parent-child attachments. During the child's first year of life, researchers observed mother-infant researchers observed mother-infant interactions in the home, recording their perceptions. At 1 year, each infant-mother pair was brought into the laboratory for a brief experiment called the strange situation. At various times in the 20-minute procedure, the infant stayed with the mother and a stranger, with only the stranger, and alone for up to 3 minutes. The idea was, and still is, that separating a 1-year-old from her attachment figure within a strange environment should activate the infant's attachment system. One should then be able to study the infant's responses at separation and reunion. The most useful assessments came at the reunion episode of this paradigm. The baby's response to the returning mother, it turned out, was programmed by how the mother had interacted with her during the first year of life. Those infants who had received attuned attention from their mothers at home showed signs of missing their mothers on separation. They greeted their returning mothers by initiating physical contact. They were soothed easily and returned quickly to spontaneous play. This pattern was called secure. There were also a number of insecure patterns, variously named avoidant, ambivalent, or disorganized. Avoidant infants did not express distress on separating from the mother and avoided or ignored the mother on reunion. Such behavior did not denote genuine self-reliance, but the pseudo-autonomy that we noted, for example, in rheumatoid patients, the belief that they must depend only on themselves since trying to obtain help from the parent was useless. Internally, however, these avoidant infants were physiologically stressed when the parent returned, as measured by heart rate changes. The infants falling into the insecure categories had been subjected to non-attuned parenting in the home. They had received implicit messages of maternal emotional absence, or mixed messages of contact alternating with distance. Already at 1 year of age, the infants were exhibiting relationship responses that would characterize their personalities and behaviors in the future. The strange situation experiment has been duplicated hundreds of times in many countries. The observations at 1 year are accurate advance indicators of behavior at adolescence, including such features as emotional maturity, peer relationships, and academic performance. On all these measures, children who had been securely attached infants scored consistently better than insecurely attached ones. However, as Daniel Siegel explains in his book The Developing Mind, the most crucial finding concerning the intergenerational transmission of parenting was that the infant's performance in the strange situation could be accurately predicted even before the child was born. Professor Mary Main at the University of California, Berkeley, formerly a student of Dr. Ainsworth's, developed an accurate means of assessing an adult's childhood attachment relationship patterns with his parents. Her technique considers primarily not what a person said in response to questions, but how he said it. The patterns of people's speech and the key words they happen to employ are more meaningful descriptors of their childhoods than what they consciously believe they are communicating. The intended meaning of words reflect only the speaker's conscious beliefs, from which painful memories are often excluded. The real story is told by the patterns of the narrative, fluent or halting, detailed or characterized by a paucity of words, consistent or self-contradicting, along with Freudian slips, revealing asides, and apparent non sequiturs. The test developed by Mary Main is called the Adult Attachment Interview, AAI. Just as with the responses of infants in the strange situations, the narratives of adults could also be classified along lines that reflected the degrees of security they had experienced in their early interactions with their parents. It turns out that the AAI is the most robust predictor of how infants become attached to their parents. In other words, what an adult unconsciously reveals about his own childhood during the course of the attachment interview will predict his own attachment patterns with his children. Thus, AAIs conducted with the parent before the birth of an infant were able to forecast accurately how the infant would behave in the strange situation at 1 year of life. Furthermore, when those children are followed 2 decades later, their performance in the strange situation is found to have accurately predicted their own patterns of narrative in the adult attachment interview. Thus, the adult's AAI narrative of his own childhood will often predict how he will nurture his future child, and therefore how his child at 1 year will respond in the strange situation. And the child's behavior in the strange situation will foretell the type of narrative she, in turn, will give about her childhood 20 years later. Parenting, in short, is a dance of the generations. Whatever affected one generation but has not been fully resolved will be passed on to the next. Lance Morrow, a journalist and writer, succinctly expressed the multi-generational nature of stress in his book Heart, a wrenching and beautiful account of his encounters with mortality, thrust upon him by near-fatal heart disease. The generations are boxes within boxes.
A breed of mice
Inside my mother's violence,
severely
we find
enough to create
another
serial
box,
killer mice.
which contains my
I don't
grandfather's
think
violence,
we'll be able to explain
and
the
inside
sort of
that box,
psychodynamics that
I
were
suspect
involved in
but
your
do not
fucking
know,
movie.
we would find
Let's try
another
that.
box with some such black secret energy. Stories within stories, receding in time. Blame becomes a meaningless concept if one understands how family history stretches back through the generations. Recognition of this quickly dispels any disposition to see the parent as villain, wrote John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist whose work threw scientific light on the decisive importance of attachment in infancy and childhood. Whom do we accuse? If we see that stress is transmitted transgenerationally, we can better understand
So while
why
Gabbard
so many of the
continues to
histories we
analyze me here,
encounter
I'm going to
speak of families with generations
call this
of
a night.
disease, or if several members of the
But
same
that gets the
generation
rest of the
affected by
patterning in
widely disparate
across the
and
sky.
apparently unrelated illnesses. Some
And so
random
far, so
examples:
good on the
Natalie,
uploaded version
multiple sclerosis.
of
Her
my
oldest brother was an
Gabor.
alcoholic
Nobody
who
says
died of
no.
cancer of
I
the
think
throat.
this one might be
Her younger
okay.
sister is schizophrenic. Her uncles and aunts were
I
alcoholics.
do wish he would focus
maternal
more
grandfather
on
was
psychological
alcoholic.
ailments
Her
than
husband Bill
physical
died
ones,
of
though.
bowel
He's
cancer.
got some very interesting
Her son
points to make
has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder
about everything.
and has struggled
God,
with drug
what a great
addiction.
book. But
Veronique, multiple
my
sclerosis.
personal issues with
She believed she
ADHD
was
is a
conceived
variety
during
called
incestuous
ADHD
rape.
6 Ring of
In her
Fire,
adopted
which is
family,
basically a
the maternal
version of
grandfather was an
schizophrenia.
alcoholic, and her
Comes
maternal
accompanied with
grandmother
audio
developed Alzheimer's
hallucinations,
disease in her 60s.
which can
Among
be a
other
little bit
medical
maddening
problems,
from time
her
to
father
time.
has early onset
Enough
high
so
blood
to have
pressure.
driven me completely up the wall.
Sue Rodriguez.
Oh, how long ago
ALS.
was that now?
Her father died of alcoholic
About
liver
15 years
disease.
ago.
One
Jesus
of her
Christ,
aunts
it's been a
died
minute.
of a brain aneurysm, another in a house fire.
So anyway,
Hannah,
that's another
breast
story
cancer.
for another time.
Both her
But
mother and maternal grandmother died of breast cancer, but neither through genetic
that's it for
transmission.
this for the
Hannah
moment. It's starting to
inherited
come
a breast
along.
cancer gene on her
Next
father's
up,
side.
we'll start detailing
She has
each
two
scene,
sisters. One is
fleshing
living
out the
with an alcoholic,
figures, lighting,
the other is mentally
detailing,
ill.
shadowing,
Gabrielle,
and this one's getting
scleroderma
closer.
with features of rheumatoid arthritis.
Well, actually, it's probably
Her
about
parents were alcoholics.
60%
Her
right
brother
now.
has had a colectomy
considering all the
for
scenes have
cancer
to be
of the
done.
bowel, and her
And
sister
I'd like
was
to
recently
re-highlight the
diagnosed
trees
with
and
breast cancer.
clouds and do some more general details.
Jacqueline
But other
Craig,
than that,
multiple sclerosis.
it's starting to
Her
get
grandmother
there.
was
So
traumatized
have a
by
good
the
night,
death
Earth.
of
Thank you
other
for watching.
children.
That's Adam Sturch
About the
Broadcasting
time
from the
her
Mushroom
mother
Mansion,
died.
Taos, New Mexico.
Jacqueline's
Working on
mother
oil
and
painting
sister
nurture.
with cancer.
And for anyone curious,
Father
that is
developed
Gabor
Parkinson's
Mate's When the Body Says No. The
Ronald
hidden
Reagan,
cost, or
colon
the
cancer,
cost of
Alzheimer's
hidden
disease.
stress.
His father and brother were
And it's
alcoholics.
an amazing
Second wife developed breast cancer.
book
His daughter
with
died
personal
of
accounts,
metastatic malignant
and then the
melanoma.
science describing
The reader may
the
recall from
causes
chapter 1
of
the outraged
their
letter from a
symptoms.
rheumatologist in response
So
to my article
pretty
about
fascinating
Mary.
stuff.
I had
Anyway, have a good
suggested
night,
that
everyone.
Mary's childhood